Who decides what you see? It's a simple question, but the answer is one of the most important and most misunderstood truths of our time. It's not just about what's on the news tonight. It's about the movies you watch, the music you hear, and the articles that pop up in your feed. It's about the very architecture of your reality, and that architecture has been shrinking. In 1983, if you wanted to know who controlled the flow of information in America, you'd be looking at about 50 different companies. They controlled 90% of the media. 50 distinct voices with 50 different agendas and 50 different bottom lines. By 2011, that number had collapsed. That same 90% of the media was controlled by just 6 corporations. 6. This isn't a conspiracy theory, it's a documented historical process of consolidation. And today, we're going to pull back the curtain and look at the blueprints. We'll trace the roots of this control, examine the moments that accelerated it, and confront the uncomfortable truths about who owns the microphone in the 21st century. To understand how we got here, we have to go back to the man who wrote the playbook, William Randolph Hearst. By the 1930s, Hearst had built the largest media empire in the country. He owned 28 newspapers, a movie studio, radio stations, and 13 magazines. At its peak, his media machine provided the news for 1 out of every 4 Americans. Hearst's model was simple and effective. He sold papers with giant headlines and sensational stories about crime, sex, and corruption. He and his rival Joseph Pulitzer engaged in what became known as yellow journalism. But this wasn't just about selling papers, it was about wielding power. The most famous example, the Spanish-American War. Hearst's newspapers published such dishonest and exaggerated reports that they whipped up public fury against Spain, effectively pushing the United States into a war. He proved that if you own a big enough microphone, you can manufacture public consent for almost anything. While Hearst was cornering the news market, a similar consolidation was happening in Hollywood. The film industry was an oligopoly, dominated by the Big Five studios like Warner Brothers, MGM, and Paramount. They were vertically integrated, meaning they controlled everything from production on the studio lot to distribution to theaters, and even the theaters themselves. By 1935, Hollywood was so dominant that foreign film rentals made up half of its total revenue, cementing American culture as a global export. But owning the newspapers and the movie studios wasn't enough. You had to learn how to use them. Enter Edward Bernays. Often called the father of public relations, Bernays was Sigmund Freud's nephew, and he applied his uncle's psychological insights to the masses. In his 1928 book, titled simply Propaganda, Bernays wrote that the conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses is an important element in democratic society. He argued that an invisible government of these manipulators was the true ruling power of our country. His techniques were groundbreaking. To help the American Tobacco Company, he rebranded cigarettes for women as torches of freedom, turning a social taboo into a symbol of feminist liberation. His work for the United Fruit Company was so effective that it helped grease the wheels for the CIA-orchestrated overthrow of the democratic government of Guatemala in 1954. Hearst built the machine, Hollywood scaled it, and Bernays wrote the instruction manual for how to use it. That historical blueprint is still in use today, but it's been refined and supercharged by technology and deregulation. Let's look at a few modern case studies. First, let's talk about government influence. During the Cold War, the CIA ran a program called Operation Mockingbird. This wasn't a fringe theory, it was a real, documented covert operation to influence the media. The agency embedded operatives in major newsrooms, paid journalists to publish certain stories, and suppress narratives that didn't fit the agency's agenda. The goal was to shape public opinion in the fight against communism. The program was exposed by the Church Committee hearings in the 1970s, revealing a disturbing level of government infiltration into what was supposed to be a free press. Now, let's jump to the corporate version. Meet Sinclair Broadcast Group. It's the second largest television station operator in the country, owning nearly 200 local stations that reach 40% of American households. Sinclair is famous for its must-run segments. These are centrally produced pieces, often with a conservative slant, that local stations are forced to air. In 2018, this became a national story when Sinclair forced hundreds of its local news anchors to read the exact same script, word for word. In an almost Orwellian scene, anchors across the country warned viewers about the troubling trend of irresponsible, one-sided news stories from other outlets and declared, "This is extremely dangerous to our democracy." A 2019 study confirmed the effect. When Sinclair buys a local station, coverage of local politics goes down, national coverage goes up, and the station's ideological tone shifts to the right. Of course, the ultimate motivation is often money. Look no further than the 2023 Fox News settlement with Dominion Voting Systems. Fox paid $787.5 million to settle a defamation lawsuit. Why? Because thousands of pages of internal emails and texts made public during the lawsuit revealed that Fox hosts, producers, and executives knew the claims of election fraud were false. They knew, but they broadcast them anyway. It was a clear-cut case of choosing ratings and profit over truth. So how did this level of consolidation become possible? A key moment was the Telecommunications Act of 1996. It was sold to the public as a way to increase competition. In reality, it did the opposite. The act removed most of the limits on how many radio and television stations a single company could own. The results were immediate and dramatic. Before the act, there were about 5,100 different radio station owners. A few years later, that number had dropped to 3,800. Companies like Clear Channel, now called iHeartMedia, went on a buying spree, at one point owning over 1,200 stations nationwide. Local DJs were replaced with syndicated programming, and independent voices were squeezed out. It wasn't the free market at work, it was a deliberate policy choice that paved the way for the media monopolies we see today. Now, when you talk about media ownership, you inevitably run into some very sensitive and controversial territory. It's important we address these things directly and with nuance. One of the most persistent claims is the anti-Semitic trope that Jews control the media. This is a dangerous oversimplification. But like many conspiracy theories, it latches on to a sliver of data. In 2008, a Los Angeles Times journalist named Joel Stein noted that when Hollywood studio chiefs signed a public letter, every single signatory was Jewish. Statistically, Jewish people are significantly overrepresented in Hollywood leadership positions compared to their percentage of the US population. Acknowledging that demographic fact is simply observing reality, but it becomes anti-Semitic when it's twisted to imply a coordinated, monolithic conspiracy. The heads of these companies compete fiercely. They have vastly different political views, and their shared ethnicity doesn't translate into a single, unified agenda. Conflating a demographic pattern with a secret cabal is the classic move of anti-Semitism. As Stein himself noted, the belief that Jews run Hollywood has actually been declining for decades, suggesting people are starting to understand that the reality is far more complex. Another defense you often hear from the industry is that this consolidation is just the result of free market forces. But as we just saw with the 1996 Telecommunications Act, that's not true. The government didn't get out of the way. It actively changed the rules to allow for this consolidation, often after intense lobbying from the very media companies that stood to benefit. This wasn't a natural evolution. It was regulatory capture. So where does this leave us? From William Randolph Hearst using his papers to start a war, to the CIA planting stories during the Cold War, from Sinclair forcing its anchors to read a single script, to Fox News knowingly airing false information for profit, the pattern is consistent. Concentrated ownership allows for concentrated influence. That initial statistic is worth repeating. In one generation, we went from 50 companies controlling our media landscape to just 6. Disney, Warner Bros. Discovery, Comcast, Paramount, Sony, and News Corp. Their interests don't always align, but their small number inherently limits the range of perspectives available to the public. This isn't about telling you what to think, it's about encouraging you to be a more critical consumer of information. It's about understanding that every media product, whether it's a news report, a sitcom, or a movie, is the result of a long chain of decisions made by people with their own biases, business interests, and political goals. Knowing who owns the microphone doesn't tell you if what they're saying is true or false, but it does give you vital context. It helps you ask the right questions. Why am I seeing this story now? Who benefits from this narrative? What perspective is being left out? In a world saturated with information, understanding the hidden architecture of influence is no longer optional. It's a fundamental skill for any citizen who wants to make their own informed decisions. And that, in the end, is what democracy is all about.